Okay. Hello, everybody. Hi, Marcos, Pedro.
Hi.
We have today with us Pier Paolo. Pier Paolo, if you're there. Hi, Pier Paolo. So, once again, welcome to an activity as part of the public program of the Escuela de Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos at Di Tella University. Today we have the pleasure of having Pier Paolo Tamburelli from Baukuh, the architectural office, and it's a lecture that takes part on a cycle called Modes of Practice. This year it's being coordinated by Juan Marcos Feijó and Pedro Mañasco, that are professors at the school, and we are investigating and researching the idea of no-nonsense practices. We have already had a lecture by Abel Parles from the Productora, the office, and so I'll be making a very short introduction to the cycle and the current agenda, and then Pedro Marcos will present Pier Paolo, and we'll have a conversation at the end. And so, as I was saying, Modes of Practice aims to survey the current state of the profession as a field of disciplinary deployment, opening a space in which influential emerging architects make explicit their way of operating, and they conceptualize their ways of understanding the practice of architecture. The cycle addresses modes of organization in which the coordination of fields of expertise, management roles, and internal and external policies become a way of doing architecture. Project protocols are reviewed, promoting interest in the ideation of working structures, the development of forms of knowledge, and the generation of images. The denaturalization of practice is thus conceived as the flip side of the mythification of theory. And as I said, we're currently exploring the idea of no-nonsense practices, that are practices that present a spectrum of practices that process their projects in simple, direct, straightforward modes, mediating seriousness with efficiency, insensitive to any deviation or a priori movement from established values, and concentrating their efforts on constructing forms of problematization that do not result in extravagant ideas, forms, or methods. The passion for normativity is driven by an ethic of objectivity in which the call of the absence of style becomes a form of expressivity. For no-nonsense practices, there are no interpretations, metaphors, or prolongations of the concrete. There is no reverse or beyond appearance. What is seen in its superficiality is what is. Okay, so I hand it on then to Marcos. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Pier Paolo, and welcome to the Tirana. I'm going to introduce you and Baukuh. Baukuh operates in the fields of urban and landscape planning, public construction, and housing, interior design, and exhibitions. Its partners, Paolo Carpi, Silvia Lupi, Vittorio Pizzigoni, Giacomo Suma, Pier Paolo Tamburelli, and Andrea Sanderigo, are actively involved in research, education, and publication. Based in Milan, it has been involved in projects ranging from the territorial scale to the scale of objects. Other projects include the House of Memory in Milan in 2015 and the new entrance of the Brewery Pavilion in Duno, Olona in 2019. He's currently developing the restoration of the Seminar School in Hoogstraten and the new headquarters of the Albanian police in Tirana. They have received the honorable mention of the Fritz Hogger Prize 2017 and the Rotterdam Biennale 2007, and they have been nominated for the Mies van der Rohe Award 2017, the Golden Medal of Italian Architecture, 2012 and 2016, the Zumtobel Group Award, 2014, and the Yakov Chernikov International Prize, 2006 and 2008. They have been included in the Dome's 50 Best Architecture Films, 2020. And now, once we have introduced you, we can start with your lecture.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you all, especially Manuel, Juan, and Pedro, but more in general, Ditella. I mean, in another circumstance, I would say it's a pleasure to be here, but the reality is I'm in my kitchen, so it would have been a pleasure to be there. It is nevertheless an honor to be invited by Ditella, and yeah, I would like to thank you and the institution for these. I believe we can move to my presentation that is rather simple. And after a discussion with Manuel, Juan, and Pedro, we talked about this idea of no nonsense and about what I provisionally called for this lecture, an architecture of common sense. An architecture of common sense means an architecture that tries to deal with the specific condition with which it is confronted and tries to make something out of it. So it's an idea of architecture that, in a way, if you want, is based on a very Italian Machiavellian tradition that is a tradition of reflection on occasion. So on the fact that you're not alone in the world and you cannot pick your opportunities, but you have to somehow be able to combine your personal attitude, your skill, what for Machiavelli is virtù, with the opportunities that come around. So this is famously treated by Machiavelli in chapter 6 of The Prince. And I would not go so much into these, but what you would see is very random collection of things that we happened to do in recent years. And I would like to start with this project that we realized in Tirana in 2010, which I present as a start because not only Tirana, it's a very special context. Albania, Tirana is the capital of Albania, which is one of the poorest, if not the poorest country in Europe, that is nevertheless right in front of the Adriatic Sea. So it's a very far away context in a way, if you are Italian, but at the same time is an extremely close context. And after being involved in research at the Braga Institute in Rotterdam as a student, after being involved in research about the urban development of Tirana, we've been involved as an office at the very beginning of our office by the, at the time, mayor of Tirana, who is now the prime minister of Albania, to build something in Albania. So we were contacted by this developer and designed this thing, which we maintained deliberately alien, so to speak. So we produced this building that was exactly matching the rather complicated building regulation of the site, and at the same time had this sort of roughness and almost animal energy. And then we proposed this project. The project was approved, then nothing happened. Then at a certain moment, a friend of ours went to Tirana and said, do you know they are building your building? and we actually didn't know, because actually the owner for which we designed this thing sold the building, sold the project of the building, and someone else realized it. And so this building has been realized completely outside of our control for the first, I don't know, 7 levels. And then at the very last moment, we suggested a few adjustments, but actually somehow this is a building that is the product of itself, so to speak, a building that was adult enough to build itself on its own. This was a very early experience for our office. More or less at the same time, we did things that were much more, in a way, theoretical, much more abstract, like this proposal for a pavilion, Italian pavilion for Expo 2010 or 2012, I do not remember, in Shanghai, in China. And this building was then presented with this massive model, like a 2.5 meter by 2.5 meter model of this ceiling that was digged in order to produce this sort of landscape of domes floating on top of the pavilion, floating on top of the exhibition spaces. And this thing that looks so pure in these images was actually made and represented through these very big and very heavy model whose back looked a little bit like this. And in a way, somehow this thing shows the strange relation that in our work is established in between a rather abstract position about doing architecture, a rather precise and dry interest in making space that is then combined with very, at least at the beginning, because I think nowadays we wouldn't do these anymore, but at least at the beginning there was a little bit this something in between punk and craftsman's a sort of attitude for which we produced, and we produced it ourselves, so that there were no employees in the office at the time. So I made this model myself, and this thing again looks a bit like this. This is something that we kept on doing. This is another case for a competition for the open spaces around the reconstruction of the castle in Berlin that has been, I think nowadays almost ready, has been rebuilt more or less exactly as it was before World War II. And we proposed surrounding it and completing this real initiative with this open spaces treated as an Italian garden with the edges and so forth. And then we built this very theatrical model of all these things. It's very, very big model that you see photographed by Stefano Graziani, who often collaborate with us. And this space where we place this very big thing is actually Palazzo Reale in Milan. Now, this very magniloquent, in a way, attitude is also combined to much more practical everyday opportunities. This is a competition for a very large school in a town in the outskirts of Antwerp in Belgium. This is a competition we won more or less in 2016, 15, something like that. And it's a very large, it used to be a seminar, so a school for priests, but nowadays it is no more. It is nevertheless very large system of schools ranging from primary school to to what you call middle school in Italy, at least, and then to high school. And all these buildings were somehow randomly placed there, and we decided to regroup all of them around this large courtyard that is bigger than the Forum of Pompeii in terms, if you want to have a reference. And we propose building all these little pieces of portico around to redefine this space as a public shared open space. So there were all these interventions, like very minor, like a portico here, another one here, a bicycle shed there, that over a period of time, over a very long period of time, because we are still doing this thing that goes on with exemplar Belgian slowness for ages, and we do a little fragment every 2 years, and you see all these series of little elements that should, in the end, compose a single figure. These are once again photos of Stefano Graziani of this model that is photographed in our former office. Here you see the bicycle shed, and this is what we built 5 years ago. It's basically a sidewalk and a restoration and a bus stop in front of the school. And now we are developing another of these little pieces that is the bicycle shed. That here you see in a rather aggressive, monumental way, fashion, but actually looks a little bit more like this. And this is then combined with a restoration of the courtyard and so forth. So a very slow, very banal in a way type of work, very common in Europe. It's basically the standard production for a known star office in contemporary Europe is doing something like this, like adapting public infrastructure, pieces of public infrastructure that is rotting around, and trying to somehow produce form out of very, very small gesture that need to be distributed over very long periods of time. This is another competition we won this time in Tirana. It's a very similar task. This is but it's much bigger and in a way also much more monumental. This is the so-called student city of Tirana, which is a set of dormitories realized from the 70s to the 80s. So when Albania was a socialist country. It looks like prefabricated slabs, but actually it's not, because Albania never reached that technological level. So it's load-bearing walls construction. But nevertheless, it's a system of student housing without a real public space, without a real set of facilities, in which we proposed a process of urban restoration, but also we proposed introducing new functions into this system and redefining the main public space as a very large lawn, a little bit like somehow, and even here as well, we proposed, and you see in this model, a serious phasing of intervention, in which you start with some transformation, some pieces of these very long portico that encircles this lawn, and then some public buildings, the red one, and then finally completing this thing. This is a model we produced to show this thing at the Versailles Biennale a couple of years ago. And you see that there is this very long but very simple gesture, basically a portico made in concrete, something that in a way you wouldn't be able to do in Western Europe. It's a 700-meter long portico, so It's quite a big gesture. At the same time, it's very basic construction. It's not conditioned. It's just a portico in concrete. And somehow in Albania, it is still possible because of two reasons. One is that workforce is extremely cheap still. And if it's not technologically complicated, building is still relatively cheap. And the second is that Albania is probably at the moment one of the few countries in Europe that has a commitment toward architecture. So there's a desire to build up a public infrastructure that looks public, that has a certain political commitment, because of the very particular condition of Albania, where all of these apparatus of public building is still largely non-existent due to the history of the country. And so particularly because of the passion of this former mayor and now prime minister for architecture, you find yourself operating in a very strange context that to a certain extent is post-communist and post-modern, but at the same time looks like a little bit like a Renaissance condition. And of course, these comes with the good of it, but also with the bad, because these processes are never particularly clear, and you are somehow involved in operations that, from point of view of the procedure, would not be possible in Western Europe, for instance. So this is a bit the condition, a condition that very clearly you can decide whether you accept or not. And we very clearly decided we accepted. We thought it was, with all its problems, we believe this is a rather positive moment in history of Albania. And this effort, although sometimes questionable, is altogether something we would like to support. So we, you will see a lot of other projects in Albania that are somehow defining, I would say, one of the extremes of our everyday production. And on the other side, we have this much more, in a way, elegant, but at the same time questionable, I believe, production for contemporary art and for a system of biennales. This is a pavilion we produced for Chicago Biennale in 2017, where the curators were Mark Lee and Sharon Johnson, who are very close friend of ours. So we had the opportunity to produce this pavilion with a lot of freedom. And given that the Biennale was titled Make New History, and very explicitly try to reestablish a link with history of architecture, that is something that I think we share, that is something that links our work to the work of Mark and Sharon. At the same time, we thought it was interesting to ask ourselves why we should relate to history, why should we make new history, and why this new history should be based on actually on old history. And our answer for our interest, particularly in the architecture of the Italian Renaissance, was that in the architecture of the Italian Renaissance, there's a very clear commitment toward architecture as sort of public art, as a system of representation of a public shared project. And we were interested in the fact that this issue of representation comes up very explicitly in the Italian architecture of the Renaissance, also as a problem of not only of political representation, but also of representation of architecture itself. So there is a very strong link in between painting and architecture that's never been as strong as in that moment. So we decided to produce a space, a strange model in a strange scale, like in scale 1 to 2. So something that's something in between a model and a building. That was a space, it was a so-called chapel that was designed to host public scenes. So it was the title of the installation was Chapel for the Scenes of Public Life. And this chapel was also covered on the interior with representations of this public life, once again taking place in space. So the fictive plot that we imagined was the meeting of two mythological figures. One is the Queen of Sheba that comes from Piero della Francesca, and the other, well, first of all from the Bible, but from the interpretation of Piero della Francesca in Arezzo, and the other figure is Enrico Mattei, who is a political figure of Italy of the 60s. And these two figures are taken as somehow two figures with only a public dimension. So stressing this desire for a public art, that's something that we think is completely, almost entirely ignored in contemporary art, and probably architecture is one and only form of art that still cares about this. So these are all the different evolution of these drawings that we produce for the interior of this chapel. The drawings represent this meeting in the Palazzo della Civiltà in Turin, that is an abandoned building designed by Pierluigi Nervi for an expo of Italy 61. And all of these are the process of drawing and then making collage and then touching it in Photoshop and then going back to drawing it again until at the end we sent these drawings to Chicago, and a group of students redrew that with markers on this gigantic piece of paper. And this is a bit the chapel in the making. This is how it looked like from the outside. And this is how it looked like inside with those drawings. Completely different thing. We still do architecture at very different scales, from the scale of the object to really territorial scale. This is a very large competition for a large development, actually the biggest development in Milan and possibly in Italy in the next 20 years. A competition we did 2 years ago with a large group, including also Chris Gantenbein on site, Atelier Campetil and Lola. And it's a competition we lost. OMA won this competition. And it was for an area that used to be a rail yard and that was relatively close to the city center, but has always been separated because of two reasons. One is the rail yards, and the other one, in our opinion, even more significant, the fact that there is the monumental cemetery of Milan before. So the cut produced by the railway and by the cemetery that very strongly presents the city with a conclusion, like it pretty much looks like the city stops there. The cemetery we consider at the same time an obstacle and a resource because the cemetery, I mean, this is a cemetery where basically no one is buried anymore, and it became a sort of park of the city. So people go to this cemetery and use it more as a park. It's not becoming so much as a part of a park, like, I don't know, the Leverens and Asplund Cemetery in Stockholm, or maybe even the Recoleta, I guess it's called, cemetery in Buenos Aires. But still, this process is ongoing. So we thought, why don't we take the cemetery as a park and we combine it together with part of the park into the site that has a very difficult shape. So we couldn't really produce a shape inside of that area. But on the contrary, it was possible to produce a park by somehow collaborating and considering the cemetery a park. And so using these trees that are there for 150 years that are very monumental and very beautiful. So this was actually the proposal to create this large oval forest with very strong formal decision, and then somehow distributing all of the built volume around it in a very pragmatic manner, somehow relating to different parts of the city around. And so you see how this figure would place itself in the system of parks, and this is Parco Sempione, is the most important 19th century park in Milan. This is Giardini di Porta Venezia. And you see how this figure would immediately become like part of a system of other figures. And because of these belong to the history of the city from the beginning, although it would be a much different sort of thing, like much more, in a way, much less classical, much less precisely defined, because it's also completely crossed by railway and needs a bridge and all sort of infrastructure that I think is not necessary to describe now. Not to mention that these initiatives would help solving a bit the environmental issues of this city that start to be extremely warm in summer. So the presence of a large forest in this extremely dense part of the city would help reducing at least a little bit, and in the best simulation, almost half a degree, the temperature in the summer. This is, again, a model in a photo by Stefano Graziani of this proposal. The model is placed in the Collegio Helvetico in Milan. And here you see a little bit the skyscrapers at different sides, a little bit like an old, very nice project by Herzog de Meuron for Berlin, and this proposal to reuse the terrace on top of the cemetery, of the western side of the cemetery, as a promenade connecting to the bridge and to the other side of the city. You see here the connection with metro, with different infrastructure. And this is a little bit the scheme where you see these oval forest, the bridge, new offices of the city, and the different developments in these different areas. This is a bit the program. I don't think we should go into these too much. And even more, in a way, high society, even more fancy. We were invited in 2019 to produce two pavilions for Außenwirth, for that is an important gallery based in Zurich and London and, well, Los Angeles, wherever, and for an important art fair called Frieze London 2019. And we were asked to produce two different pavilions for let's say, art produced in Italy in the 50s and 60s, mainly in Milan. That is the case here with Piero Manzoni and the Metro by Albini, or Alighiero Boetti, or Fontana, and in Rome. The pavilion we designed for the Rome exhibition was canceled, so this never been built. Actually, the one we loved the most. What was built was the one a little bit more banal in a way for the Milan show, that is this, where you see these very elegant sort of furniture, reminding a bit of the upper middle class, if not sheer haute bourgeoisie, Milanese bourgeoisie of the 60s, with this atmosphere, this mahogany paneled wood, and these art, Enrico Bai, and so forth. And totally different thing, a little pavilion for brewery in northern Italy, like a small, rather abstract, simple building that then looks like this. This building is somehow made of two halves. One half is a cone. It has a window here. It has an object in the middle that supports the building that is entirely built in wood. And that takes inspiration a bit from this project by Schinkel for a hunting casino in Eastern Germany, that at the time in Eastern Prussia, nowadays in Poland. And this thing with this absolute geometry, very simple interior, is then placed in the entrance of this brewery that is quite a crude industrial area in the somehow in between Milan and the Swiss border. So one of the most industrial landscapes in Italy. And you see this object is somehow capable to survive into this quite nasty context because of its extreme formal autonomy that emerges even more at night, where it looks like little UFO landed around Varese. And again, a project in Albania, this is probably the most, in a way, unusual one. This is the campus of where the Albanian police has its headquarters. And we were asked to rethink entirely this campus and to imagine sort of urban restoration once again. So we proposed to exploit the topography of the area and placing all the rather challenging requirements, like an Olympic swimming pool, for instance, that was absolutely unavoidable. And by somehow respecting the a bit clumsy, but in the end, relatively clear organization of the system with these headquarters and all these buildings on the two sides. So we, so to speak, restored all of these, and then we designed an entirely new building for the offices on this side, and a new building for the forensic science department. Now I would talk, so these are the buildings we propose to demolish, and these are the new buildings. This is a bit the side, quite beautiful, with these bunkers, somehow a survival of the communist era, and these rather wild field in the extreme north of the area, where actually the access is from here and from here, and then the area slopes down. And what we really wanted at the beginning was not to build in the most obvious place, the one that was close to the street and so forth, but actually to build on top of the existing buildings, these buildings here, that are, as you might see, on a significantly lower level than the rest. So if we could build a building here, we could still, from this position, see the mountain in the background, and more significantly, we will have this curious condition that our building would, in a way, look like ruin emerging from lower level. An architectural effect that we thought was very interesting. So somehow merging a condition of let's say, a very large monumental portico like this one of the Palazzo dei Congressi by Libera, with this condition of Egyptian ruins. This is Luxor, and somehow creating a very unexpected condition in which the building was at the same time very monumental, but also subject to a very unpredictable experience. So what we proposed was this, so a building with a very big colonnade. This thing is almost 100 meters long, but this colonnade is somehow cut at the bases, and the building looks much lower than it is. So this is then the building with these slightly dumb frieze in sort of Atari sort of graphic design, as if the text police would actually run from left to right, but actually it does not run. It's there and it will not move. And then you have this portico that is a very narrow portico because it's not really made to be used that much. And this unexpected section in which somehow there's nothing in front of the portico because the level of the nature is much higher. So these are a bit images of the other side. These are a bit the axiomatic of this building that is a very simple, massive building that has to be realized with relatively simple technology, in which we try to introduce some environmental solution, like very basic but efficient, some natural ventilation for coming out of these wells. And it's also an incredibly deep building that tries to minimize the amount of energy that is spent. And it's also very complicated in its subdivision in different departments. And we also had to design all of these in 3 months because the commission came in a very strange way. And this is a little bit the situation where we are now. These are different levels with terraces and so forth. And you see a scheme with the distribution services and these ventilation wells in the middle of these rather chubby arms. And this is a bit the details of these quite high columns, because these columns are 14 meters high, and the details of the frieze. And even more strange was the request for the forensic science, the building of the forensic science, because this building was added at a certain moment, and it was added under the condition that it would be paid by with a grant of the United Kingdom. Don't ask me why. And the idea was that this building should basically be a copy of another building of a similar size that among the different buildings in the United Kingdom for forensic police, the most recent and the one most similar in size was the one of the forensic police in Belfast. That is new because the previous forensic police in Belfast was destroyed in a terrorist attack by IRA in the 80s, if I'm not wrong. So I had to go to Belfast to visit this building, not exactly a masterpiece of architecture. And the idea was that we should copy it literally one-to-one. So we thought, okay, why not copy a building? That's not a problem. And we got the plans of these. I mean, part of the plans, because it's secret, all of that. But we could see the building, and we got a list of all the different departments and their requirements. And from an architectural point of view, the only interesting feature of this building was that this is a block with the circulation outside. There's also circulation on the other side. So we thought we could do something out of it. It could look a bit like Sozza's monument or Palazzo dei Tribunali, or also this forgotten building by Vittorio Gregotti in the periphery of Rome that we somehow like. And we came up with this thing where you see it's actually the same dimension, same amount of levels, 2 entrances as it was requested, 1 for the employees, 1 for the delivery of crime evidence, and circulation stairs and elevators at the 2 ends. So these are 2 axonometric drawings of it. This is a model, an extremely simple building, concrete structure wrapped into an insulation around. All the same windows. These are the renderings that our partner office in Albania realized that at the beginning we didn't like, but at the end we came to like for their somehow exuberant arrogance that yeah, well, at the beginning we thought, oh no, it's a bit too brutal, but actually in the end somehow fits. These are the plans. You see all these rather specific things. We hope they will start construction soon for this thing. And you see these 2 entrances where there's this little bit of architecture that are these 2 triangular entries. And then this is a typical plan with these large ducts for installation, stairs and elevators and toilets, like based on a super simple grid. And somehow respecting the condition of redoing the building of the police in Belfast. This is last thing we did for Tirana. This is a competition we did with Johnston Markley, Yellow Office, and Bollinger Groman, and with Matilde Cassani for the new city hall of Tirana. A little bit of details. It's basically a very large pergola in which the office tower is immersed with connection with 2 pavilions for the main auditorium and the council room. A bit of references. This is the selection of plans that Yellow Office suggested for this area. So you see it's a very uniform grid, a little bit like a early Muslim mosque, in which these gigantic columns supporting the tower are placed with this entrance and lobby. You see a bit the volumes during day and at night, while some of the references and the idea of producing a complementary space to the new Skanderbeg Square. That's the new central square of Tirana, realized recently by a Belgian office called 51 and 4E. A very beautiful space, but actually a space that in summer is completely in the sun. So we propose to have a complementary place where under this pergola, there could be a bit of shadow, as you might see here and here. So these are details about the pillars that reuse patterns typical of Tirana, blah, blah, blah. This bit, the section, the plans. Yeah. And one of the last things, this is a large territorial research about the metropolitan region of Geneva, developed with Stefano Boeri and Michel de Vigne, and Transsolar and Systematica, in which we started our research work from these very large, almost secret institutions that are distributed in the territory of Geneva. That is obviously this is CERN, the large underground particle collider. And another case that we study was the United Nations. But then through the research, at a certain moment, we reduced the polarities to the CERN and the Salève, that is this mountain that sits a bit in the middle of the landscape of Geneva. We were guided and here by our collaborator Guillaume Yassen from Geneva, who brought us here together with Armin Linke, who took these photos. And somehow discussing with scientists at CERN, well, it would be a very long discussion, but we discovered that CERN is actually planning a much bigger collider that would go, would have a radius of around 40 kilometers, and that the existing one is this one, that is 30 kilometers in circumference, if I'm not wrong. And strangely enough, the placement of this new research technology that would be, for the large majority of its trajectory in France, because Switzerland ends more or less here. Already the Salève is in France. Somehow this circle would coincide with, would have the Salève more or less perfectly in its center. So that was for us a way to recognize a new form and a new scale for the city. Once again, it's very pragmatic, the whichever opportunity to recognize form we use. And And here it was instrumental to visualize a new potential city made not just of Geneva and the outskirts and the lake to a certain extent, but a new city made of Geneva and Annecy. And so two lakes, the Lake Geneva and Lake Annecy, with at the center, not the city, but a green core made of the Salève. And because of that, you see here a little bit of data on the existing LHC, so Large Hadron Collider, and this new thing called so far the FCC, the Future Collider, Circular Collider, which somehow has this mountain precisely in the middle. And then we developed a strategy for the city to produce a zero emission zone at the center of these, and to develop strategies for transportation, infrastructure, and distribution of energy more than anything, using the future infrastructure, not only for scientific experiments, but also to transfer energy, and then to pragmatically connect to points on the surface that could be linked to future urban expansion. So somehow this figure is a figure that totally disappears in the landscape that can be perceived, but is a figure that allows to define a new map of the city. And in order to describe these, we produced this large panorama of the region. It's a 360-degree panorama of the entire Genevois region from the top of the Salève. So here you see the city of Geneva with the famous jet d'eau, this water jet. And here you see the Lake Geneva, and to the south, the Alps, and the French region. And at a certain moment, you will see appearing the Lake Annecy, and the line, the dotted line in colors that you see in the middle, is ideally the trajectory of the new collider. So these are the this is the drawing all together. These are details. I think we can go on. And the last thing I show you is, again, at a completely different scale. This is an apartment in Milan, in the city center. This used to be a laboratory, a textile laboratory. And this is the cadastral map. You see, it's extremely simple, almost 2 squares with 5 pillars in the middle, which actually remains the concept of our house. It's a rather special house. It's a house for single, and it's rather big. And we imagine these large. All our effort was to keep this very large space empty, and to somehow define the 2 facades at different ends of this large room. It's more or less. I don't remember how big it is, but it's large. I think the apartment is around 250 square meters. And so at a certain moment, we came with this idea for this complicated stepped object on one side that is in a way based on things that are very different, like Albert's square and Raffaello's podium for Madonnas. You see, there's infinite version of these squares by Albers, but there's also infinite versions of podiums by Rafael. And you see this object that catches the light from the windows and somehow gets relief, but at the same time is a very alien object that doesn't really shows its nature. And on the other side, you see the kitchen and the other elements. The two sides are entirely covered with this very beautiful white tiles. You see there's a corridor here. This is the kitchen. There's a toilet. There's a room here. And you see this system. So actually this strange object is made of a closet that you open on the inside of a corridor that gives access to 2 rooms and a master toilet. And you see that space in between is left completely open. And this is a bit how the thing looks like now. And you see how the stepped elements catch the light. How do they react with these different nuances to the light coming from the right? And I believe this is my last slide. So I think I am.
Yes. Per Paolo. Okay. Yes. Thank you for the presentation. Amazing. Very, very interesting work. Yeah. Maybe while we receive questions from the audience, we can start a conversation of our own. I don't know, Pedro, Marcos.
Yes, I will start. First of all, thank you very much for the lecture. I think it was very interesting and with a lot of different works and examples. First of all, I will start with the name of the lecture. It was consent, and consent is described as the belief or propositions that are fed by society, a way of not thinking and not thinking and not analyzing critically or scientifically facts given as natural without prior methodological investigations for society. For example, Henry Bergson describes it as the faculty to orient oneself in practical life. However, the lecture reviews the history of architecture in a cultural sense. And what do you think that that common sense is, and how is it defined, captured, made explicit, built, or even consensual? And if there is one common sense?
Well, I missed the last part of your question because the connection is not really.
Yes, the question was, what do you think that common sense is, and how is it defined, captured, made explicit, built, or even consensual? And
well, I don't know what common sense is.
One common sense.
Yeah, well, I don't know what common sense is. I think the issue of common sense as a really, really long philosophical tradition, common sense can be an enemy, like an enemy that you want that you can use to distance yourself from. I think Descartes does this. Or it can also be something you decide to go back to. I think there's a book by G. Moore that's titled in A Defense of Common Sense or something like that. What I think we can take from these subdivision is that in general, common sense is something that is a bit dumb. This we have to accept. So it's not so brilliant, it's not so provoking, it's not so innovative. It's actually common sense. It's boring. And in this sense, I think we are rather boring. We are rather commonsensical. We tend to accept a lot that I think architects that want to be more avant-garde, that want to be more provocative, that also want to how to say, market their own morality, would not do. They would not do. I think a lot of people would not do the headquarters of the Albanian police for some reason. Some might even be good. And also, I think a lot of people would not accept that they should design a building by copying actually another building. And by the way, an ugly one. But we are fine with that. There's no problem. We think that if there's a little margin, we can take that margin. And I think the attitude that you see in these different scales and different projects is always in a way very tolerant. Okay, you want a building like the police in Belfast, fine. But then there's always a little bit of a twist, and it's a little bit of a twist that sometimes the client doesn't really like. And when that little twist is not possible anymore, then we are out. So the common sense is relative in a way. It's also, I think, in more cultural terms. For instance, in the last building we showed this apartment that is gridded, and I think this grid could in a way look pretty much like super studio sort of thing, but in reality it's really not. And it's also true that maybe some of my partners have a different opinion on this, but I'm not a fan of super studio at all. I think it's rather a pretentious work with very little basis. And what we did there is a sort of abstraction that is much less in your face, is much less based on sort of ideological claims that I think are a bit out of place, and that is there because of very specific material quality, because in the end we produce architecture. And I mean, it's very difficult to broadcast an argument through architecture. That's maybe the beginning of our common sense. We can do the Albanian police copying this thing because in reality, in 20 years, nobody will remember what were the specific conditions for the production of these, and what will be left is only the building. And if building has certain quality, these qualities will stay. Then the issue is also, do we make buildings that are capable of lasting so long? Maybe not so much anymore, but all in all, I think our common sense is somehow the product of these, certain realism, a certain sense of humor. In a way, the reality is that we even like it. Like, if you tell us, oh, you should copy the building of the police of Belfast, we actually think it's cool, which is probably a bit stupid, but yeah, it's like that.
Yes.
Maybe I can, I don't know, Marcos, if you want to make another question.
You can keep.
Maybe a small, silly one, but first of all, thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting and amazing. I really am like very much your position towards pragmatism, because I think that you're pragmatic not to reality or not to like contingency, but to architecture itself. Like you have a pragmatic approach to the discipline. Like this comes given, and so we use this and we don't care much, so we use this shape or this form. Maybe I want to hear more about your ideas about pragmatism. I don't know if you understand this position of pragmatism towards architecture that I mean.
Well, again, even more than common sense, I think pragmatism has a certain baggage, so it comes with several interpretations of pragmatism. I do not think we are very influenced by classic American pragmatism. That it's not really in opposition to that. It's just that as Italian, that remains a little bit outside of your. I mean, unless you really go and search for that's a little bit out of the usual cultural landscape. So what I would say is a bit different. I think we are rather abstract type of architects, so that we can make, let's say, forget about these, forget about that, and move the conversation to a very specific formal level that allows to be rather tolerant with all of the rest, which brings me to an issue of theory. We have quite an explicit interest in theory, but contrary to other people who think that theory is good theory only if nobody understands, actually theory we consider something very practical. Because if you have a theory, that theory can be used to operate in reality without rediscussing everything every single day. So I think there's a combination of theory and practice, of formalism and tolerance, that I think we have been trying to develop and we've been working on in these last years, that I think is maybe the most significant contribution we made. And I don't know how to summarize these. I think we are working on these fundamentally, on, again, the little quote, the little reference to Machiavelli at the beginning. Like, I think there's also this idea that, yeah, you have to combine virtue whatsoever, skill, knowledge, but then you need to be able to turn into something, let's say, real. And there's a moment in which there's this moment that for Machiavelli is the opportunity, l'occasione, in which actually you can either do it or not do it. And that very political skill, that is the main skill of the prince, it's the main scope of the book. It's actually very difficult to have, and it's also a practical skill. And I don't even think we have it so much, honestly. We would like to have it, but I mean, so far we didn't add these crazily great opportunity, problematic, but significant. In reality, we are doing most of the time relatively small things. So we would love to actually do bigger things. We're not the sort of architect who thinks that the best is to do one building every 10 years, but to design it perfectly. At the same time, we cannot control the occasions that are coming. So we're basically doing everything. Like, we're not refusing any of the things that come our way. And my lecture was also a little bit random, I think, because these occasions are random. They're in different places. They are for very different type of clients. I think we also have a profile as a company, if for a while you discuss this, that is in a way wrong in commercial terms, because we do too many things, not really clear what's the core business. We also, our tolerance is, I believe, in terms of marketing our company, is not an asset in the current economy. And on this level, we are a little bit of a suicidal architecture office, but not too much. I mean, that's an everyday struggle to not to be the completely suicidal architecture office, and to work on this, not completely sell out, and at the same time, not completely prevent people from coming to you and say, hey, you know, we would like to do a small pavilion for a brewery. Can you do that? And yeah, because in the end, in order to make architecture, you need clients. And that's one of the interesting things of architecture.
Well, let me jump in, and then we can, I'm sure Pedro and Marcos have other questions as well. But I was thinking about something you just said, like they were maybe a random presentation. But at the same time, I really like the name of the talk, or the idea of common sense, and I thought that you could weave a thread or something through all the projects, and understand and to see different maybe amount of common sense, maybe. But then I'm trying to find the words to phrase the question. But because I really like the idea of starting a project absolutely relieved of the pressure that you have to actually do something, not in a nihilistic way, but in like not in a egomaniacal. You're relieved of egomaniacal pressure, let's say, or narcissistic and so on. So I thought that common sense was like the medium through which you were relieved of that. So I don't know. I really like the reference to Gregotti, for instance, or Luxor. Okay, but then when in the actual projects, and let me explore this idea. There is not only common sense. There is always something else. Like you see lots of grids, let's say, and monotonous repetition, as in a positive, commonsensical way. But then you have colors, and then you have a twist, and then you have a peculiar material in the first project that like in that first project, it was, I think, pretty clear which part was commonsensical and which part was not commonsensical. Like having a building that is exactly the volume permitted by the local law is absolutely commonsensical. But have it look like an elephant, well, it didn't look like an elephant. Or have, let's say it more precisely, but have a material that is not so, that makes it alien, is not commonsensical. So the way of question to make this a question and not only a comment is how do you level both? Or
yeah, well, talking about that building, I mean, it's a very specific condition. It was at the beginning of our career. We couldn't design it. Like we just produced a couple of images and very few drawings, and then it was built. But that was the result of an experience, because before that we designed another building in pretty much the same condition. Like in Tirana, there's a landscape of palazzine of 8 floors that are somehow given by the size of the plots and the technology that is always concrete construction and so forth. So the first one we did, we thought, okay, we designed something that's extremely simple and pure, that is easy to realize, and will survive in these difficult circumstances. The reality is that the minimalism doesn't work in that conditions, because minimalism needs the definition of the detail, that the corners are sharp, that certain little things are precisely done. And after we discovered that actually that didn't really work out, that's also the reason I didn't show that, because I mean, it's not really a success story. The second time we thought, no, actually the first one was a failure. We actually should do an architecture that is incredibly expressive and very rough, and it has an image that is so strong that then the builders, whoever they are, could approximate even without us. And I think it was more successful. So that was actually somehow learning by doing, maybe not learning too much. And actually the condition of Albania market is completely different nowadays and 15 years ago. So now the construction industry became much better. So again, that building is by far the most expressionist, if that word can be applied to our, I mean, I consider expressionist borderline insult. So, I mean, it's really not my thing. But that's by far the most expressionist thing we ever did. And that's not because we wanted to be more aggressive there, but it was just a reaction to the conditions.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe Pedro, Marcos, but I was thinking about this idea of common sense, that maybe if you would or if anybody follows a design process which is absolutely commonsensical, and in each of its decisions, I'm not sure how commonsensical that architecture is at the end, because I'm not sure common sense is actually a coherent, consistent system, or this coherent system of values and so on. I think common sense is crazy in itself. It has its own craziness.
No, I agree, and I, on top of these, I mean, I might downplay it as much as I can, but in the end, I believe architecture is an intellectual practice. So there is a moment in which the formal operation needs to become sharp, and also to a certain extent risky or challenging. And I mean, I cannot point it out in my own work. I mean, it's something left to the others, but I think that should be part of the work. So I don't think common sense is enough, but common sense is background, is something towards which you can project your work. And in a way, you can call it with many names. You can also call it context. And And we are, in a way, very contextual architects. Although that doesn't mean that we are, let's say, doing necessarily, I don't know, ionic columns next to a building with ionic columns and whatever, mirror glass next to a building with mirror glass. But I think architecture is something that is placed in a certain position, that has a certain place, and it is in that place that establishes its own relation. So yeah, I think we need this sort of background in order to operate. Also because we are, and this I think we can say, we are rather boring as person. So we do not have these amazing personal experience that we want to communicate to others. We need to be confronted with a certain reality and to reflect on that and to react to that. Like our architecture is completely reactive. Like we belong to a very Italian tradition of contropiede. Do you know what's contropiede in football? That's counterattack. So we are not an offensive sort of architecture office. We are defensive architecture office.
Okay, I got them. Yeah, and I have a question that from Ana Font, a professor at the school, that she's asking what are your intellectual references, if you believe they're all historical, and with what other practices in Europe you feel related.
Wow. Well, the intellectual references, I don't know what to say. I mean, it's. I mean, I don't even know if it's in architecture or I don't know. Let's say, let's limit the thing to architecture because otherwise it's a bit too much. So we are 6 partners. We have different backgrounds, of course. I think we all share an interest for the architecture of the Renaissance. I would say particularly the second half, the Italian Renaissance from Brunelleschi to Bernini, let's say. We have an interest for some architecture of the 60s and 70s, like for sure Rossi, but also, I don't know, maybe American architecture like early Cesar Pelli, things like that. And maybe to give it a more clear reference, I think we all agree that the most fundamental architect of, let's say, the generation before us was Rem Koolhaas, by far more important than anybody else. And that also the discussion in contemporary architecture is a discussion on how to interpret the work of Koolhaas. We used to do this magazine called San Rocco that probably you know, and one of the issues that we had this list of issues that we should do that, and some of them we didn't do. And one of them was titled Left and Right Koolhaasian, a little bit based on the distinction in between left and right Hegelians at the moment in which Hegel died. And I think that's a bit the debate on contemporary architecture, like what to do of what Rem Koolhaas did, how to interpret his work. And I think there's a right-wing Caucasian, I don't know, Bjarke Ingels, with all respect, but it's a different thing. And then there's a left-wing Caucasian, and I guess we might be part of that. And of course, we share a lot with other practices in Europe and abroad. I mean, some are the people you invited for this series. I don't know, Productora for sure, or others. I think it's also a list of people that's pretty, in a way, also banal to make. It was the people who wrote for San Rocco, and I don't think there's really whatever sort of shared discipline, but
Well,
there's a shared interest in architecture.
Well, Anna Font's question had a follow-up that is related with what you are saying. That is, how did the San Rocco period influence your move into practice?
Honestly, I would say zero. Like we were into practice before, we are into practice now. San Rocco was quite successful in terms of itself, or maybe our academic career and so forth. But in terms of, let's say, practical consequences for our practice, I would say absolutely zero. Like also in, like our market is still mainly Italy, and I don't.
But not even stylistically or as a way
no,
of
because
doing
we
things.
were actually we were doing those things before. So
Okay.
like San Rocco is a consequence of our office, but I mean, no, actually we only got a little bit bored. Like of all these axonometric and this stuff. So that's a reason, one of the reasons why we stopped doing San Rocco. And no, but in terms, like if I have to give advice to somebody who wants to run a practice and make money, making architecture magazines completely useless initiative, and it doesn't change your, let's say, professional career in any way. I mean, it's over. Maybe in the 60s, I don't know. It's completely over. Maybe if you start to have 500,000 followers on Instagram, maybe that makes something, but I don't know. Or maybe more, several millions.
And maybe a follow-up to that. And what sense do you make of writing? Like, do you still find the practice of writing useful? And if it's not a magazine, where can writing fit in? And going back to Kohlhaas, like I think that in Kohlhaas, writing was very important to make, I don't know if sense, or to tense the practice with the theory, or to build the theory while
Sure.
practicing.
Sure, but Kohlhaas is anyhow still an architect of the 70s, when in Europe you still had, let's say, socialist or pseudo-socialist parties in power, or at least they had regions of power, and they could influence transformation of cities. And they at least had some minor components who were interested in culture and intellectuals and would read books and blah, 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 but that's over. And I mean, I'm absolutely in favor of going back to that, but reality is it doesn't exist anymore. So, I mean, if you like a couple of years ago, I was at this conference for 50 years of complexity and contradiction in architecture. And I reread Complexity and Contradiction and the Architecture of the City. And Complexity and Contradiction is a book that looks as if it's been written yesterday. Like the sort of references is completely about architecture. There's a couple of quotes from literary critics, but very little It's very clear it's addressed to university professors, to architects, to maybe people who read a bit in the art world. And it's a rather specific, precise, rather well-edited book. The Architecture of the City, it's a mess. It's full of quotes. It's full of, like the cultural universe of Aldo Rossi is so much bigger than the one of Venturi. And it's so much bigger for personal reason, but also because he had to sell his book to the people in the Italian Communist Party who controlled a little bit of the universities in Italy and could give him a position. And so this fact means that there is much more ambition in the book by Rossi. There's much more mixing with other cultural fields. There's also much more naivety in a way. The Architecture of the City is a book that if you would write today and you send it to an editor, he or she sends it back to you and say, no way. And like,
well, but yeah, I would add another function of books in general, not every book, but at least these books that you were discussing, and for sure Cola's Delirios New York and others, and I think it's a function of writing in itself.
Oh yeah, sure. But you were making the argument of the career, and I would
but I mean, I'm sorry, no, that is, I want to say also in writing, and it's let's say complexity and contradiction, and maybe this is a little bit romantic, but I think it's true that it's not only directed to students and professors and so on, but it's also directed in itself as a medium to build a practice, to build the arguments of a practice, and there is a learning experience in it.
Sorry, I'm too cynical, but yes, no discussion. Cultural practice at the level of this contribution is cultural practice, and it's a goal in itself. There's no doubt. I mean, but there are also other things that are mixed together with that, and I think the landscape in which Rossi was operating was different from the one in which Venturi was operating. The other thing you were mentioning is that the book can be instrumental into building the practice, and I agree. Internally for yourself to clarify what you want, and I think, for instance, we wrote this little book with 2 essays, one about Giorgio Grassi and one about the architecture of the city, and that was very important for us, particularly the one on Grassi that I think is almost unreadable. But
those books are, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but they are in favor of Grassi and against Rossi. Right? It's roughly.
I wouldn't really put it like that, but if you would really menace me to death and I should side with one, maybe. I'm not even sure, honestly. Actually, what was really interesting for us was the early part of the work of Rossi. That's also the moment in which Rossi and Grassi collaborated. So that's a bit, but it's not only that, but yes, in a way, maybe. But there is this, let's say, inner component, what you write for, in a way, for yourself to clarify your ideas, and you also write for other people, and people you don't know, people who might even read it when you're dead. That was one of the let's say, we tend to forget that, but that was one of the basic idea of writing at a certain moment. And But then if we discuss about the magazine or the book as a tool in building a career in this more, let's say, almost sociological way, I don't think really plays a big role nowadays. I mean, I think nowadays careers like the one of Rossi or Sterling or yeah, maybe even Venturi, they would really not be possible. I mean, just think of a very banal thing, like these people participated in competitions that were called invited competitions because somebody invited them. And nowadays, this thing, at least in Europe, doesn't exist anymore. Nobody invites anybody. It's just you apply. And the first thing they ask you is how many employees you have and what's your turnover. And in a condition like this, James Sterling would not make any building, more or less. So the intellectual, the condition for the intellectual component of this profession changed dramatically for the wars.
Yeah. Sorry.
I mean, I'm not pessimistic in general, but we have to accept that I mean, there's
of course, yeah.
the public building, nobody makes public buildings anymore. The public buildings are small. Nobody's doing things like Pompidou or all these competition in France at the end of the 80s. Like it's no more there. And what you can do are things in Qatar for really questionable political powers, or restoring 7 classes in a school in Belgium or in Germany and this sort of things.
Yeah, I'm for sure. But I had a question that, if not, it's gonna be left unsaid. Of course, if I don't say. But
let's say at 2 o'clock we conclude.
yeah, of course, of course. Or we can go on. If
No. I mean, there's still a quarter of an hour.
No, we must be near the end. I'm sure, but it's a very light and banal question actually, and it's about the buildings of Baukuh that you presented, and it's what are the politics of, but in a banal and light way, of color. Because every building uses color. It's not in even the one in Albania with that has no color in the facade. It has color in the columns, and there is a specific use of certain. I cannot pin it down, but there is a certain gamma or a tone of certain type of colors and a certain way of using color.
Well, actually, the building in Tirana has these colors of the Albanian police, and actually forever we did these pillars with the base of these pillars a blue and dark red, because that's the uniform of the police. But then actually we discovered that the official color are actually horrible color to me, because they're black and red. And as a supporter of Inter Milan, I mean, black and red is really disgusting. But I mean, that's the color of the police. So that's it. No, I don't think we have these special passion for color, but color is one of the elements that are available. I mean, and anyhow, buildings have color. Even buildings by Chipperfield have color. They are gray, but they use color. So, I mean, it's unavoidable. No, there are moments in which there's a touch of something. That's true. But color, one of the good things about color is that it's cheap. It's relatively cheap and has quite some effect. But we are not into sort of color, let's say, deliberate color investigation of the kind of, I don't know, Sauerbach Atom or things like that. No, not really.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe Marcos or Pedro have a last question, and because I'm sure, I mean, it's been almost 2 hours of the lecture, and we can close it up, wrap it up. Or no, okay.
Well, no, I mean,
yeah.
I mean, I say that, but I don't want to. I mean,
no. I think the presentation was really generous, and we've gone through many topics, and maybe we can wrap it up now. It's really great having you, and I'm sure we'll have a next opportunity to
yeah,
meet
that would be
you.
nice.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Pier Paolo, and we'll
Yes.
see you soon.
Ciao, and thanks again for the
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ciao,
Ciao.
thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Bye. Hello.
Bye bye.